Hey there, Hetty here, jumping right in from where we left off in the last video titled Low-Hanging Spiritual Fruit, which I've linked in the description. And this time what I want to do is talk about visualization by focusing on the goals of the process, which I'd argue matter, rather than the technical approaches to achieving them, which I'd argue don't really. For my part, the distal or ultimate aims of visualization in my practice vary, but here is probably the most common trio of goals: separation, embeddedness, and interaction. First up, separation. That is, the sense of distance from my mundane surroundings. This generally involves both emotional perception of distance and physical inhibition of the material environment. This necessitates, first and foremost, inhibiting intrusion of material reality, sensory deprivation or flooding, both of which are meant to keep one's sensory organs from responding to intrusive external cues, is therefore often a paramount first step, and separate the means by which subsequent exploration or whatever else ensues, although the two are often confounded or treated as if they're the same. I stress that the goal is to keep intrusive cues at bay, because we don't really need there to be nothing sensory going on. And barring the use of some pretty heavy pharmaceuticals, the latter is practically impossible. In fact, sensory deprivation generally isn't deprivation at all. It's monotonal flooding. That is, flooding the sensory system with a single unchanging, read predictable, stimulus that, due to the way we process sensory information, becomes indiscernible after a short time. The use of strong incense, whose intensity masks slight variation in the chemosensory environment, is one example. So too is white noise, as are some repetitive refrains of the sort that often accompany binaural beats. Even those sensory deprivation chambers in which people float in water are more correctly called monotonal sensory flooding. It isn't that water can't be felt at all initially, it's that shortly after feeling it, and assuming the water doesn't move or change temperature, which is generally kept at about body temp, you come to stop feeling it after a time. On the visual end, the easiest means of shutting out the environment is simply to close one's eyes. And presto, there's your goal of inhibiting visual intrusion from the external environment achieved, provided there aren't any pulsing bright lights about that can reach your eyes through your eyelids. One important interjection on breathing while I'm at it. You know how we've often been told to focus on our breathing, inhale for 5, hold, exhale for 5, yada yada? Yeah, so the idea with breathing, like everything else going on in the outside world, is to forget it, which makes the idea of focusing on it sound sort of anathema to the goal. A couple of things to keep in mind, though, are that, firstly, a lot of meditative work centers on mindfulness-style meditation, which is not the same thing we're trying to achieve when distancing ourselves from the environment, which includes our bodies. In many ways, it's the opposite, so I personally think mainstream meditative advice should be assessed before it's implemented, and should never be mistaken as inherently applicable to craft trance or meditation work. Secondly, focusing on one's breathing can indeed lead to improved separation by rendering the act constant and unchanging, that magical ingredient that leads to obliviousness to what was once sensorially apparent. The key is simply to focus on breathing until it's become constant and regular, and then to let that awareness fade from one's mind. Now, I privately suspect that drawing a firm line between material separation and emotional distance from mundane reality isn't as easy as we might be tempted to think. Rather, they probably interact a fair bit, and although by default many of us may rely on sensory separation in order to help evoke emotional separation, I believe you can switch this around and achieve material separation by distancing emotionally or mentally from the material realm. which is to say that one can, in essence, skip much of the sensory trickery and manipulation by exerting control on higher order functions like awareness, attentional focus, and emotional involvement. Here is where the distinction between sensation and perception is important to keep in mind, because control of the latter is usually the actual goal. The former is largely optional, a theme I'll touch on again in a minute. Next comes the process of embedding oneself in whatever environment will facilitate the task or exploration we hope to achieve. That second step, which often involves visualization, but which I suggested earlier, shouldn't be confused with the first. And really, visualization is simply one way of achieving embeddedness, a convenient one at times, but by no means necessary. So embeddedness. What I mean when I say embeddedness is this: immersion in an alternate environment. As with separation, this immersion generally includes both emotional components as well as perceptual ones. Notably, embeddedness also denotes access to items, thoughts, or entities that don't occupy material space, but it does not include direct interaction with them, because I think it deserves its own step and spiel. From a mechanistic standpoint, I think it's useful to imagine the process as a shifting of involvement or allegiance from one space, concept, environment to another. In distancing ourselves from the material realm and its various intrusions, we free ourselves up to visit someplace else, to think thoughts that have no ties to the mundane world, to experience emotions that are too complex or chaotic to engage in while trying to navigate consensus reality. Being visual creatures, many of us will discover or create these alternate environments using the visual modality first and foremost. But that is, in large part, just us importing the constraints and necessities of mundane reality into different worlds. Often, I think, we rely on visualization because it's hard to let go of our physical being. And I mean this in both the wooey philosophical way as well as the straight-up biological sense. For sighted individuals, an environment that lacks visual representation may be too alien to invest in, which means too foreign to become properly embedded within. And so we are encouraged to build up our visualization chops as a means of bridging that emotional and experiential gap. Failure to make that leap is then blamed on the lack of ability to visualize, rather than a lack of being able to bond with the created or discovered environment, whatever modality it may be represented in. But I'd like to propose that instead of fretting over the lack of visualization skill you may or may not suffer from, the problem of embeddedness would be better tackled from the perceptual end, from the emotional and attentional ends, which is to say, tackling it by becoming more adept at allowing spiritual environments, whatever they may encompass, to affect the way we feel. Emotional investment in environments can take any number of forms and be achieved a lot of ways. Some of the approaches that I found particularly useful are: 1. Personalization, attributing external consciousness and intention to a space, a line of thinking, to the sense I get when I'm in that environment. By surrendering sole proprietorship of an environment, you inherently grant a little bit of its control to something else, whether that's your unconscious mind or some other being. In doing so, you increase the probability of that environment surprising you, and thereby becoming more substantive, more real, more immersive. 2. Revisiting. The importance we grant a place, a state of mind, or an idea often grows with repetition. It's not unlike getting to know and becoming invested in a person through multiple interactions over time. I've had whole worlds and/or my attachment to them build themselves around me simply by planting a mental seed and coming back to it again and again to see how it grows. The environment changes with every visit, unsurprisingly, but core features remain constant. and exploring what doesn't change in particular can be extremely enlightening. There's your archetypal imagery and key correspondences right there. Which brings me to 3, planting an emotional seed. Quite literally, invoking in oneself an emotion as intensely as possible, which you can do any way you like, whether it's listening to your favorite angsty song or remembering a dear moment. This can be done in visual or contextual nothingness, at which point a world, series of thoughts, sounds, whatever will likely begin to build themselves around you, or in a partly constructed environment to which you feel unattached, or which doesn't feel stable. Again, the stability of, say, a visualization has, I think, a lot less to do with visualization skill than it does with caring about the visualization. 4, belief as a tool. A lot of you will be familiar with the concept, I'm sure, and the skill works just as well when the goal is believing that you care. Convincing oneself of one's emotional investment in a concept, place, or thing is a rapid and effective means of embedding oneself in a spiritual environment. And again, if you build the emotional scaffold, the perceptual richness will grow around it. Last but not least on this incomplete listing, 5, probing your shadows. This one in particular is worth trying if you feel like you have trouble embedding yourself in mental spiritual environments, in large part because the sensory associations tied to shadows already exist, which in turn alleviates the need to exert creative effort altogether. Your emotional involvement with them is ready built, and in the world of shadow, sensory experience and emotion are generally already conflated anyway. They echo off one another, rebounding and setting off new reactions all on their own, until you can't really help but fall into their world. Now let's get back to what is usually the 3rd and final goal of visualization for me: the capacity to interact with items, thoughts, or entities that don't occupy material space. Differentiating between access and functional interaction is, I think, important, because the quality of embeddedness relies to some extent on not feeling like you're distanced from the environment, state, concept, etc., or on the environment's capacity to influence you. By contrast, interaction depends on feeling like you can impinge on the environment without breaking or overriding it, particularly as relates to its impact on your emotional and perceptual state. The former, embeddedness, is passive. The latter, the capacity to interact, demands action. Here's the thing, though. I think when people run into trouble on this score, it isn't always that they can't interact. It's that while doing so, they self-monitor too much. In the material world, as we focus our attention on something, say on stirring a pot, our attention narrows. The periphery, provided it doesn't suddenly change, fades and seems to disappear. However, being material, it doesn't disappear. It's still there and still feels like it's been there the whole time when we at last glance up from our stirring. The same can't be said for mental environments, particularly visualized ones. In your visualization, what's prone to happen when you reach for that spoon and begin to stir the pot is that the rest of the environment literally disappears, which is fine, as long as your attention is fixed on the pot. But the second you look up and you're slapped upside the head by the impermanence of all the shit that's supposed to be around you, it screws you up. Frankly, again, the problem then isn't that visualization of peripheral motifs fades. The issue is that we expect it not to, and then scold ourselves when it does disappear, or when there's a lag in its reemergence, or when it reappears slightly differently. This disappearance-reappearance shtick, though, it's a feature, not a bug. The time lag, the spatial disparities, and general dreamy quality of complex scenes is the nature of the mental realms. It's a world of signs and symbols, and what comes, goes, stands stronger, brighter, or wonkier than the rest are the very signs many of us wish we saw more of in the waking, walking world. It's a world in which a thing can look, taste behave utterly differently than how it quote-unquote should, while still being absolutely identifiable as what it is. A person needn't have a face or even a form to be clearly and unmistakably Joan or Brenda or Jim. Because the pictures in your head, or the sounds, or the shorthand mental nomenclature with which something is tagged are merely representations. And these representations change in response to the receiver, which means that none of the quirks I've described are a failure of visualization at all, nor do any of them inherently impair our work. Our response to them, on the other hand, can absolutely throw a wrench in the gears. And here's where practicing visualization, or auditory work, or body consciousness, or following twisting trains of thought into alien territory is primarily useful. It helps train us not to be so uptight about our technical performance or abilities, and instead habituates us to the differences inherent in the mental realm so that our emotional reactions don't bugger our shit up while we work. In the end, attaining separation, embeddedness, and interaction in the mental realm has more to do with being able to allow yourself to experience the full gamut of what your mind can access and produce without critique or running commentary. It is, I think, a question of emotional control and acceptance that the rules are different in this realm you're trying to make your own. So I say we all stop trying to correct the new laws of physics and simply acquaint ourselves with them instead. And then screw the technical nonsense and the never-ending parade of apples. You're already fully equipped with the skills necessary to handle the sensory end of things, whatever your particular abilities or limitations may be. It's acceptance of the nature of our visualizations that needs work. Until next time.